Guys, BG in the house. Hope everyone's doing well. It's Friday evening. It's the day before Chris Eubank Jr. versus Arthur Abraham, and I've just sat down to watch the weigh-in. Arthur Abraham has missed weight. He's come in a pound and 15 ounces heavy at the first weigh-in. I'm unclear whether further attempts have been made or will be made to make the weight. I suspect not, because 1 pound and 15 ounces overweight is considerably overweight, and I suspect Abraham will struggle to make the weight in the time he has in the lead up to this fight. So looks like the fight is going to continue with an overweight Arthur Abraham. What does this mean? First thing it means is you have to question Arthur Abraham's dedication. He's always been a fighter who's tried to fight at home, fight in Germany. I, for one, thought it was a bit odd that he was coming over to the UK to take this fight with Chris Eubank Jr. It didn't kind of strike me as Arthur Abraham's modus operandi. Perhaps he knows that his career is coming to an end. He is, after all, in his late 30s now. Perhaps he suspects that the test of Chris Eubank Jr. will, at this stage, prove too much for him. And is this Arthur Abraham looking for an easy cash out on the way out the door? Is he looking for one final decent payday before sailing off to retirement into the proverbial boxing sunset? I don't know. If that is the case, if he hasn't been motivated, if he hasn't trained at his hardest, perhaps this is good news for Chris Eubank Jr. Potentially, you've also got to consider whether or not Arthur Abraham has tried to come in heavy for tactical reasons. Has Arthur Abraham decided to put on some extra weight against a guy in Chris Eubank Jr. who has moved up from 160 more recently, against a guy in Chris Eubank Jr. who we know likes to fight up close and on the inside? Has Arthur Abraham decided that not draining himself to cut weight and potentially coming in a pound or two heavy could give him a strength advantage on the night? It depends how you look at it. You could easily make the case this is Arthur Abraham not being motivated, but you could just as easily make the case that this is a deliberate tactic from Abraham. I mean, he didn't look in bad shape. Anyone next to Chris Eubank Jr., when you're standing next to Chris Eubank Jr., it's hard to look as lean and as cut up as Chris Eubank Jr. But he certainly didn't look in bad shape. It didn't look like he would let himself go massively and looked like he was unfit. Eubank Jr. on the other side was in supreme physical condition, as we've come to expect consistently throughout the course of his career. When Eubank Jr. initially made the step up to 168 pounds, I came online and I made a video saying that we wouldn't see him at 160 pounds again. I stated that he had missed weight on several occasions, just by a few ounces, but he's clearly very tight at the weight. I stated that as he was getting older, he would clearly be too big for 160 pounds. And I stated, that when his body gets used to making 168 pounds for fights, it's going to be very, very difficult for him to go back to weight draining himself to 160 as he gets older. Now, at the time, I got a lot of stick for those comments. I got a lot of people saying he's just moved up to 168 for the Reynolds-Quinlan fight. He'd be able to chop and change between the weight classes. But I believe that I am right, that we will not see Chris Eubank Jr. back at 160. And this is despite the fact that he's been commenting all week about how he's not had to cut weight, how he walks around at this kind of weight, how he doesn't have to, how he can eat a full breakfast the day before a fight or the day before a weigh-in, etc. Let me say I'm sceptical of those comments. You look at the shape Chris Eubank Jr. is in when he steps on the scales. There is very little in the form of body fat on him. There is very, very little in the form of water weight on him. He's clearly stepping onto those scales in peak physical condition, ripped to the nth degree, with very, very minimal unnecessary fat and very minimal unnecessary water on him. I don't believe, looking at that physique, that there's 8 pounds of extra weight that could easily be lost. People think he could get down to 160 again. I disagree. I think he's at 168, and I think that's why he's made the step up to 168, and I think that's why we've seen him enter the World Boxing Super Series tournament. As I've stated before, his career at 160 is certainly over, in my opinion, and after fighting Arthur Abraham at 168 and after entering a tournament which potentially ties him up for his next 3 fights, I doubt that Chris Eubank Jr. In 18 months' time, after he's completed that saga of fights, will still be able to cut down to 160. If you looked at him compared to Arthur Abraham today, you could see that Arthur Abraham maybe had slightly more meat on the bones, but Eubank Jr. appeared to have a bigger frame than Abraham. He appeared to be taller than Abraham. You know, he carries muscle mass, Eubank Jr. He's got a big frame, he carries muscle mass, and whilst there isn't a lot of fat on him, whilst there isn't a lot of water on him, I don't believe that he's walking around at exactly 12 stone between fights. I really don't. I believe he's still cutting weight, I believe he's still dieting, and I believe he's still having to keep himself exceptionally lean to cut down to 168. It's a long-winded way of saying that I'm sticking with my comments that I made prior to the Reynolds-Quinlan fight, that we won't see Eubank Jr. at 160 again. I feel that he's already grown into a substantially sized super middleweight. I actually don't rule out him fighting at 175 at some point in future, because I think he's easily got the physique and the frame to carry that off without having to do it by putting on needless weight. I think he's a very strongly built guy. As for Arthur Abraham, missing weight, it's unprofessional, it's disappointment. Is it a tactic? Is it a sign that he hasn't trained? You know, we'll have to wait and see. As for final predictions, I discussed it in the podcast this week, but you guys know where I'm at with this fight. I think it's good matchmaking from the Eubanks. I think Abraham is a guy who's well known. I think he's been in fights against British fighters, so is, you know, a respected name amongst British boxing fans. But at this stage of his career, I think he's very one-dimensional and very beatable. We must remember that Paul Smith and Martin Murray both took multiple rounds off Arthur Abraham. They both took 4 or 5 rounds off Arthur Abraham. And I believe Eubank Jr. is a superior fighter by some way to those kind of guys. Stylistically, Abraham's a low-volume guy who springs to action for 30 seconds or a minute of each round. Eubank Jr. is a far more athletic guy with a far greater range of punches, who has a much higher levels of volume and athleticism than Arthur Abraham. I believe the gap in speed, the gap in output will be considerable and vast in this matchup. Whether Eubank will get the stoppage is the big unknown in this fight. Eubank is suspected not to be the biggest puncher, especially at 168, and Arthur Abraham is known as a very durable guy. It just depends if the will remains in Arthur Abraham. My prediction for this fight is Eubank Jr. on points. I believe Arthur Abraham is wily enough and experienced enough to have a few tricks and to make it competitive at times, but I think Eubank Jr.'s youth, volume, speed and athleticism will be the key gap between the two. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Let me know your thoughts on this fight. Let me know your thoughts on the weigh-in. As always, many thanks indeed for watching.